Chapter 32. Fucking traffic, Knowles sighed as he pushed down gently on the gas, moving his car perhaps 3 feet forward before he had to once again brake and stop the car. It was rush hour, and he'd made maybe half a mile in the last hour. LA traffic was pretty bad at the best of times, but this was verging on the ridiculous, and he was sorely tempted to just get out and walk. It was only a few blocks down to Regent Burke, and he could make it in less than 10 minutes if he went by foot. To distract himself from the agonizingly tedious wait in the congested traffic, he switched on the car radio. The first station was some annoying pop crap, some little kid who sounded like he hadn't hit puberty, singing baby, baby, baby. Over and over again, the sort of junk his youngest daughter Amy listened to. He wondered what she was up to. She'd been pissed when he'd stopped her from taking her iPhone and laptop with her, when he'd sent her away. And he hadn't even seen Melissa before he'd gone. He hoped she hadn't kept calling Simon the whole time. For starters, he didn't want Mike charging him for a massive phone bill, but mostly just in case Kaliba were listening. He just hoped they didn't know every detail of his family's life and who they were friends with. He switched the station from the annoying, prepubescent pop crap and hopped from channel to channel, hoping to find something he liked. Doesn't anyone listen to rock anymore? He wondered aloud. He knew what his daughters would say to that, and found himself glad they weren't in the car with him. He switched station once more, a song he didn't recognize that was just finishing. And now for the hourly news update. Disaster struck last night when a Russian Navy ship sank 20 miles off the coast of California. The missile cruiser Varyag was sailing to San Francisco on a scheduled port call when the ship's captain claims was attacked by American fighter aircraft. 19 sailors were killed outright, and another 24 wounded 6 critically, and the survivors have been rescued by the Coast Guard. Russian President Dmitry Medvedev has responded with fury to the Varyag captain's claims and in heated discussion with President Obama, has demanded an official apology plus compensation for the loss of the ship and for the families of the deceased sailors, and has promised reprisals if those demands are not met. Obama has issued a statement of regret at the loss of life and injury to the Russian sailors, but he and military officials deny any involvement at the sinking of the Varyag, claiming no U.S. aircraft were in the area at the time. We'll have more on this story as it develops. Jesus Christ, Knowles muttered, shaking his head at it all. It was probably a massive breakdown in communication. Some swabby didn't get the memo about a Russian ship paying a visit, scrambles a jet piloted by some trigger-happy fucking brownshoe, who was probably already in the shit with his commanding officers who were doing their best to sweep it under the carpet. Goddamn Navy, he sighed. Overpaid and underworked, in his opinion. He knew what would happen. There'd be a lot of rhetoric, a lot of threats thrown about, and Uncle Sam would publicly deny everything while at the same time doing some under-the-table deal with the Russians. It was all about saving face. Nobody could ever take accountability for their actions anymore. Finally, he got through the traffic and pulled up at the side of the road outside Regent Burke and Hong Kong House. He parked up and left, and made his way into the front entrance. The pretty young Chinese waitress smiled, recognizing him as he walked past the front desk. "Hey, Andy," she said, knowing why he was here. "Same as usual." "Salt and pepper king prawns and fried noodles." He nodded and smiled politely. "Are you ever going to try anything new?" She chuckled. "You always order the same thing every time I see you." "Next week, I promise," he said as he went towards the staircase off to the side at the back. "It'll be ready in 10 minutes, she replied as he ascended up the stairs. He pushed open the door to Regent Burke's office and stepped inside. The reception desk was empty, he saw. Hannah, their receptionist, was conspicuously absent, which he found strange in itself. She'd never not been there, not once in all the times he'd come in to see Dominic and Brad. She'd always known just how he liked his coffee, too, and had always brought him in a steaming cup when he'd been in meetings with them. Dominic Regent limped out of his office towards him, and Knowles could barely believe the sight of the man. "What the hell happened to you?" he asked. Regent's face was a mess of bruises and cuts. He could see his 2 front teeth were missing. His arm was in a sling, and he had strips across his broken nose. "Fucking teenagers," Regent groaned, lisping as the air he exhaled when he spoke whistled out the gaps where his 2 incisors used to be. "Fucking LA," Knowles nodded. "Hate this city." "So what happened? Did you get mugged?" His opposite shook his head. "Some punk, about 19 or 20, broke in here, knocked Hannah unconscious, that's why she's not here today, and beat the crap out of me." Strange, Knowles thought. It wasn't like they had anything of value here, so why would anyone break in? There were plenty of anti-war anarchists out there who'd be all too happy to smash up the place, but it wasn't like the company exactly advertised themselves or anything. What did he want? "Forget it," he said defensively. "What's been going on, Andy? You disappeared from a job, and no one's seen you in days." "Kaliba, Dom. They're not the guys we want to be working for." Dominic poured himself a coffee from a machine on a table behind the reception desk, and then did another one, putting 2 spoonfuls of sugar into it and handing it to Knowles, who sipped it slowly. "I'm getting that impression," Dominic said quietly. "But they're our customers, Andy. You know the line of work we're in, here. We're not exactly the Red Cross. You're telling me you're here to quit. You know no one's gonna pay as good as we do for this kind of work." "Yeah," he nodded. "I'm coming off the circuit. Sorry, Dom, but I've got to think of my family here. You realize we can't pay you for the last week, since you've not actually been on the job." "I don't care about that," Knowles said. "There's one other thing you can do for me, though. You need a reference." Knowles shook his head and took another sip of the coffee. "I need a team," he replied. "As many guys as you can spare." He didn't know how many it would take. Steroids had laid waste to a whole police station back in '84. He'd take 100 guys if he could get his hands on them, though he knew that wasn't likely. "For what?" Regent stared at Knowles, his curiosity piqued. "What are you up to, Andy? What have you been doing since you disappeared?" "I'll show you." Knowles pulled out sheets of paper from his pocket. He'd gone back to another internet cafe and done some more research, and he'd found a hell of a lot. "You ever heard of Sarah Connor?" "Sure. Nut job who hated machines. She was all over the news a couple weeks back." "Well, Kaliba were very interested in her. I've been doing a little digging, and here's what I found." He put a sheet of paper with a mug shot and details of Sarah onto the desk for Regent to look at. 84, Sarah Connor is stalked by 2 men. A Kyle Reese and an unknown male. The former was arrested with her, and the latter slaughtered his way through 17 police officers to get to Sarah and Reese before all 3 disappeared. Regent took the sheet and examined it closely. "I don't see what this has to do with anything." Knowles pointed at the image of steroids, in sunglasses and black leather jacket, holding a shotgun and an AK-47, as he obliterated the police officers who stood in his way. "This guy, the one who was after Sarah, he's Kaliba's head of security. He's been the one giving me orders. He's a machine. There's another one too, and so is he." He saw the doubtful look on Regent's face and decided to press on. "I saw it, Dom. They're machines. The guy Sarah Connor and this Reese guy said was a machine is working for Kaliba, and they're building an AI for the military." She was right. He put down more papers for him to see. September 1999. A substitute teacher attempts to shoot a kid called John Reese, later identified as John Connor. Witnesses claim the shooter had a mechanical leg. Then Sarah and John blow themselves up in a bank. October 2007. Actor George Laszlo kills 20 FBI HRT officers. One survives. James Ellison. He's featured prominently in security footage for Sierra Corp Kaliba's rival alongside Catherine Weaver. And Kaliba were just as interested in her as they were Sarah and John Connor. They ordered us to eliminate Weaver and her AI. 6 weeks ago, Sarah Connor reappears and is arrested. Look it up online. She looks the same this year as she did in '99. Something's going on, and Kaliba reeks of it. You see where I'm going here. Regent looked down at the research Knowles had done and smiled. The smile grew broader and he started to chuckle. Are you sure you're okay? I'm the one beaten up, but seems like you're the one with the concussion. I know it's real, Knowles insisted. He pulled out his wallet and took his bank card out. I didn't think you'd believe me, but I know you'll believe this. He put the card down onto the desk. I'll pay for a team, same rate as Kaliba offered. 4 guys plus weapons for a 24-hour job, $4,800. This was a hell of a risk, he knew. Kaliba could track the transaction from his account. You've got my account details. Just don't take out the money until after I've gone at least an hour. Andy. He looked down at the photos on the papers Knowles had shown him, and a chill ran down his spine as he recognized 2 of the people on it. John Connor and an unknown young brunette woman. They're the ones who beat the shit out of me. The girl, she'd changed her voice exactly like his. She couldn't be one, could she? No. He shook his head vehemently and pushed the papers back towards Knowles. I'm having nothing more to do with Kaliba. I'm canceling the contracts and pulling the men out. He'd gotten in far too deep here. The money was great, but he was losing men left, right, and center. He'd been assaulted in his own office by John Connor and a girl who might actually have been a machine. Forget it, he said. Whatever you're up to, I don't want any part of it. He handed the card back to Knowles. 10 grand, Knowles offered, knowing he probably sounded as desperate as he felt. His wife would kill him if she found out he was going to spend so much money on this, but he really had no choice. Sorry, Andy. Regent shook his head regretfully. Word of advice, just leave this one alone. He pointed at his swollen, bruised face and his slung arm. Thanks a lot, Knowles grumbled and turned to leave. One more thing, Regent blurted out, feeling a slight pang of guilt over turning Knowles down. He was their best employee and had done everything they'd asked for. There was something he could do for the man. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. John Connor was here. He's the one who kicked my ass. He came here with 2 women, one of them was the unnamed girl in the photos you showed me. The ex-Marine turned back to Regent, his heart racing in excitement at this new information. Why hadn't he said so before? What did he want? Information on Kaliba, where they are, how many men of ours they have, that kind of thing. Do you know where they are? Knowles asked quickly. Kaliba or Connor? Both, he snapped. Finally, he had some kind of development now. If he couldn't get men from Regent Burke, then maybe he could find John and Sarah Connor. Who better to fight alongside than the 2 people who knew more about these things than anyone else? I don't know where they went, but they seemed to know where Kaliba was. The girl said she'd traced their exact location. No idea how. You need police or military scanners for that kind of thing, satellites. She just dialed them and claimed to know where they were. Somewhere in the Sierra Nevada mountains, Knowles surmised. They can't get there by road. If they were trying to get there, then the only way would be to fly. I think I know where they went, he muttered. He marched straight out of the office and down the stairs into the restaurant. Here's your food, Mr. Knowles. The waitress held it out. Thanks. He pulled $20 from his wallet and pressed it into her palm as he took the bag of Chinese food from her. Keep the change, he said, as he quickly rushed out the front entrance and headed towards his car. A traffic warden was walking towards the front of his SUV, a clipboard and pen in hand. "Back off," he snarled at the warden as he approached. "You're parked illegally, sir. I've got to write you a ticket." "Unless you want that ticket shoved up your ass, go find someone else to write up," he snapped, looming threateningly over the smaller man. He himself was a little over 6 foot and just under 200 pounds, and cut an imposing figure over the shorter, plump traffic warden, who instinctively backed away. He unlocked the car, got inside, put his food into the footwell of the passenger side and hit the gas. The car sped out from the side of the road, and he left the unfortunate official in his dust. He knew where he had to go now, where he had the best chance of meeting the Connors, if not there then, at least at the final destination. The hard part would be getting there without getting caught or killed first. 4 aircraft tore through the grim, gray, featureless skies over northwest Alaska in a sharp arrowhead 4-ship formation, flying in at just under the speed of sound. Captain Vladimir Svetkov looked out of the canopy of his Su-30 Flanker C and down at the gray and white, barren, icy abyss that zipped by underneath. He had a respect for anyone who could live in such a place. As a boy, he'd grown up in Siberia and knew how harsh it could be there. Anyone who lived in such frozen isolation was inevitably tougher, more self-sufficient than those who lived in easier, fatter parts of the world. Still, respect or not, he had a mission to fulfill, to avenge the sinking of the Variag. Distance to target, 68 miles, his co-pilot, Mikhail Zorlev, announced from the seat behind him. "Ida, 4 minutes." Vladimir pursed his lips nervously beneath his oxygen mask. They'd already penetrated American airspace, and so far they'd seemed to have avoided detection, but how long that would last for he didn't know. He ran a check on their weapons and found himself glad that if they were spotted, at least they were well armed. 2 jets, including his own, were armed with 2 short-range air-to-air missiles, 2 long-range ones, and a combination of 8 anti-radar and laser-guided missiles, whilst the other 2 were armed purely for air-to-air combat. It was a very dangerous mission, and they'd been equipped accordingly. Detecting radar emissions, Mikhail alerted him. He detected the radar beams sweeping over them. "They've spotted us," he said a split second before a warning alarm sounded. "It couldn't last forever," Vladimir muttered. "All aircraft descend to 300 feet, disappear under their radar curtain." He pushed down on the control yoke and pushed his flanker down towards the ground. A moment later, the other jets in the formation also descended to join him, and together they made for the deck. "Aircraft incoming," Mikhail reported, urgency and dread in his voice. "Radar cross-section is very small. They must be F-22 Raptors." "Shit." Vladimir cursed under his breath and pulled his jet into a sharp turn. They had very little chance fighting F-22s like this, not against stealth aircraft. "Attention, unidentified aircraft. You are violating U.S. airspace and must turn back immediately. Please acknowledge." "Do we engage?" one of his other pilots asked over the radio. "Wait," Mikhail shouted. He looked at his screen and saw the tiny radar signatures of the F-22s were moving away from them. What are they doing? He wondered aloud. They were headed in the wrong direction, turning at a right angle from them. Did the American pilots even know where they were? "Unidentified aircraft," the American pilot repeated, his voice sounding urgent and confused. "If you do not move to exit U.S. airspace immediately, we will be forced to engage you. Please respond." "They can't see us," Vladimir grinned. The F-22s still turned away from their position and increased their speed. What did they think they were doing? There was nothing in the direction they were heading. The American pilots were chasing ghosts. "Keep an eye on them," he told Mikhail. All call signs continue onto target, but be careful. The 4 flanker sequotests remained low and increased their speed, hugging the ground as they approached their objectives. They split into pairs, and their courses diverged as they moved to attack 2 targets simultaneously. 1 jet in each pair had the anti-surface weapons, whilst the other provided top cover. "Target is in range," Mikhail said. Their particular target was a long-range radar site. Activating targeting radar, locked on. Vladimir quickly selected his anti-radar missiles and armed them. Firing! He pressed the launch button and a pair of missiles blasted out from under his wings. They streaked forward towards the base, several miles away, leaving a long trail of smoke in their wake. He pushed the nose down and pulled the yoke right, turning away from the target as the missiles continued on their course, soaring out of sight and beyond the horizon to their target. "Impact in 3, 2, 1. We have a kill," Mikhail said excitedly. The radar emissions he'd detected disappeared completely. "Radar station has been destroyed. Foxtrot Bravo, 2nd radar station has been eliminated. Continue on to engage secondary targets," Vladimir said with a wolfish grin on his face as he turned towards the coordinates of their next objective, another radar site some 112 miles away. After that, they would have to turn around and head back home. But until then, he was determined to blast a wide-open hole in the Americans' radar nets. The gas station looked just as desolate and abandoned as it had when they'd left it. John took that as a good sign. At least Ellison and Danny hadn't been attacked by Kaliba after they'd gone. He was wary about splitting up any further, and resolved that from now on they'd all go everywhere together and armed to the teeth. He moved away from the car and started across the forecourt, towards the main entrance of the station proper. He could smell gunpowder in the air, just faintly, and looked around, reaching for the grip of his pistol and tightly holding it. There were no signs of a struggle, but that didn't mean there'd been one. When Terminators were involved, there usually wasn't much of a fight. "Welcome back," Ellison called to them as he opened the door and stepped out to face them. "Hey," Savannah nodded to him, a smile on her lips, genuinely pleased to see him. As far as emotional gestures went, that's about as much as she gave. And of course, she kept it reserved for Ellison. Even if he wasn't the one who'd looked after her all those years, he was essentially the same man. "Anything happen while we were gone?" she asked him. "I can smell gunpowder." "Oh, that. It was nothing. I just gave Danny a shooting lesson." "He any good?" John asked. "Probably not," Cameron replied. She spotted small piles of spent casings and quickly counted them up. It was unlikely anyone would become proficient at shooting after only firing 30 rounds. Ellison shrugged his shoulders and moved away from the entrance, towards John, Savannah, and Cameron, and hopefully out of earshot of Danny. "He knows which end the bullets come out of." "Great," John muttered, a hint of sarcasm in his voice. "He can take the rear when we go in." Savannah and Ellison both looked at him, confused. John had been silent on the way back from their stop at the service station and hadn't told her anything. And Ellison naturally knew nothing of his thoughts, having spent all afternoon teaching Danny the basics of surviving a shootout. "We go in where?" he asked. "I'll tell you inside," John replied. "I'm starving." "Savannah, get the food from the car." Savannah did as he asked and went towards the car. Ellison rushed out to help her, and together they carried the fast food and the other shopping John had bought across the forecourt and into the station. John followed after them, but Cameron reached for his arm and held him in place. "We'll be 1 minute," she said to Ellison and Savannah, and let the door close in front of her and John. Her charge turned around and looked at her, confusion set in his features. "What's going on?" he asked. "We need to talk." Cameron strode towards the Mercedes, and John, sensing whatever it was important, followed after her. She got into her usual driving seat, and John sat next to her. He pulled his door closed and sealed them inside the car. It was stuffy and uncomfortable inside the Mercedes. The windows were up, and the air conditioning was off. Cameron had the keys, so he couldn't just switch it on himself. They'd only got out of it 2 minutes ago, but the baking desert heat just pushed the temp up and up. "What is it?" John turned to face Cameron as he asked her, hoping they wouldn't be in here for long. He was already starting to sweat. Being a cyborg, Cameron was never one to mince with her words. "The others are worried about you," she told him flatly. "You've been acting strangely." John blinked. "Strangely?" "At the safe house, when you killed the mercenary." He didn't hesitate at that one. "You'd have killed him too," he replied. He didn't see what she was getting at. She'd anticipated John's comment and already thought up a reply before he'd finished the sentence. "I wouldn't have kept firing until I ran out of bullets," Cameron said. "I wouldn't have shouted as I shot him. You've killed before and shown regret, but not this time. I'd like to know why." "Why, Cameron?" John said tensely, a hair away from snapping. He felt himself getting hotter, and he tried to keep his temper cool. He sucked in a long, slow breath and forced himself to calm down, seeing for a moment what she meant. He'd have never gotten so worked up a week ago over this. But still, he had his reasons. "They blew up our safe house and kidnapped my mom and Savannah. That's why." I was pissed off. It didn't seem like much of an answer to Cameron. "Was it the same when you attacked Dominic Regent?" she asked. She decided again to get straight to the point. "You've been through a lot, but you can't afford to let your emotions control you, John." "That's easy for you to say," John shot back. He regretted it the instant he said it, but he carried on, wanting to elaborate on what he really meant and not what she'd have come to expect from him, given how he'd raged against her in the past. "You're in control. You're always in control. They've put me through hell my whole life, and then I actually was in hell. Then I come back. I've got you, I've got Mom. We're all back together and things are finally looking up, and they rip my world apart again. You know the kind of people we're dealing with, Cameron. How am I supposed to act, knowing what they're probably doing to her right now?" It wasn't often that Cameron was speechless, but this became one of those occasions, as she found herself unable to respond. She imagined if it were John who'd been taken. She'd never done it before, but she created a scenario in her mind where John had been captured and she was in his actual situation. She'd inherited some of John Henry's moral instincts, but she knew, deep down, that she would have coerced Regent the same as he had. She'd have made the same decisions, but she wouldn't have been prone to the emotional outbursts that he'd displayed. It wasn't his actions she was concerned with as much as the mental and emotional state behind them. "You're wrong," she said, sadness in her eyes and her voice. "I don't have as much control as you think." "The kill order," John swallowed knowingly. She nodded and looked straight at him. "I don't know if it will ever resurface. If it does, I don't know if I can stop it. I can't control it, and you've lost control yourself lately. I'm worried about you too." He paused and let that sink in. Cameron was afraid of something. Despite what his father had told his mom, she knew fear, and she was afraid for his sake and nothing else. "Ellison and Savannah, isn't it?" he said to her. Not accusing, not angry, just matter of fact. "Are they both behind me still?" She decided not to tell him that Savannah had suggested she take the lead. "For now," she answered. "I said I'd talk to you." "And you?" John asked nervously, knowing this was the all-important question. If the others decided they wanted out, he wouldn't try to stop them, but he needed Cameron to be on his side. He couldn't do this without her. Are you still behind me?" "No," Cameron answered plainly. She saw the look in John's eyes instantly and recognized the pain and betrayal, and realized she needed to word her response better. "Not behind you," she said. "Beside you." Her place for as long as she lived would be at John's side, whatever happened. John reached for the back of her head and pulled her towards him as he leaned his own down until their foreheads rested against each other. In the stuffy, hot confines of the car, their sweat mingled where the skin touched, but neither one of them cared. "Thank you," he said quietly to her. She just reaffirmed to him that she was with him on this, all the way, and no matter what the outcome, no matter how batshit crazy he went, she'd be there to help him, and if necessary, he realized, to guide him back into line. Did she do this for future me? He asked himself. Was she this much of a rock for his future self in another timeline? If so, had he fallen apart after she'd left? He searched his own soul and knew the answer to that, and determined that under no circumstances would he ever, in 1,000 years, send her away. "I know what I'm doing," he told her. "Trust me." "We should go back inside," Cameron finally said. "They're waiting for us." Together they left the car and went back into the station, to find the others already tucking into their meals. Savannah munched happily on her double cheeseburger and savored the taste of the fried meat, onions, cheese, and ketchup as they danced across her palate. It was over an hour cold, but she didn't care. Anything was better than eating rodents and algae. There was a whole world of different foods out there to be tasted, and she decided that, when they stopped Skynet, she was going to try them all. The world around her was barely there. It was just her and her food, and as she judged the scene around her, she was happy to keep it that way. Danny ate his burger quietly, as did Ellison. John and Cameron sat down with them to make a rough circle, and the former opened up his own food. Despite having shared Savannah's life for 3 months and turning ravenous at the sight of any pre-war food, he ate mechanically and took no real pleasure in it. He couldn't anymore. He was entirely focused on the shit that had happened in the last few days and how he was going to put it right. He took another bite, and a dollop of ketchup dripped from atop the meat and splattered onto his chin. He didn't even seem to notice. He only reacted when Cameron reached out and wiped it from his chin with her thumb. Her touch shook him back to the real world, and he turned to her as she licked the ketchup off her thumb and memorized the sensations it sent to her tongue. "You okay, John?" Ellison asked nervously. He nodded once, his face a blank slate. "I'm thinking." "Don't let it turn inward," the older man told him. "It wasn't your fault." "It wasn't anyone's fault," Savannah said. She knew Cameron assumed she was responsible for hacking the defense net and for Skynet tracing her. And John had already blamed himself. "It doesn't matter whose fault it was," he replied. "It matters what we do about it." Both Ellison and Savannah looked at him, sharing his sentiment. They both wanted little Savannah back. The older Savannah didn't want her younger self to be tortured, to be traumatized, and turn out like her. She wanted her mini-self to have a chance at a normal life, something she'd never had and probably never would. This was normal to her, and she wouldn't wish that on anyone else. Ellison felt a bond towards the younger Savannah. He felt responsible for her, and the thought of what she must be going through pained him, angered him, even. Sarah was strong, and she could probably withstand their interrogations, at least for a while. But Savannah was just a kid. She didn't deserve any of this, and he shared John's thoughts exactly. They had to get them back, and they had to do it soon. "About that," Danny said. "Have we got some kind of plan?" "We know where Kaliba are." Cameron took out a map that John had bought and placed it on the ground. She pointed to a spot east of Mount Whitney, along the Sierra crest. If Sarah and Savannah hadn't have been captured, she would have accessed the defense network again, hacked into Creech Air Force Base and ordered several Reapers armed with rockets and bombs so she could launch airstrikes. But now it would be too dangerous. She couldn't do it without risking Sarah's or Savannah's life. We know where their mercenaries come from, and we know they get into LA via Oxnard Airport, John said, pointing at its location on the map. We know a silver helicopter ferries them to and fro. We head there, wait until a helicopter shows up and the goons depart, and then we take it. Small problem, Savannah commented. None of us know how to fly a helicopter. They all knew it was a good point, but it failed to deter John one bit. The pilot does, he said. We do what we have to make him fly us there. We've got weapons, and we've got the element of surprise. So we fly in, storm the place, grab Savannah and Sarah and get out. Ellison asked. We don't know how many we're up against. No, John shook his head and picked up an M4. He opened up the grenade launcher and slotted a 40mm explosive round into the breech before closing it and pumping the slide. We do, he nodded at Cameron. 24 mercenaries, she said. All ex-military. She'd read the files of each man assigned to Kaliba. All of them had been frontline soldiers, mostly infantry, and most of them had combat experience. She wasn't as concerned about them as something else they hadn't discussed, however. Plus an unknown number of Terminators, she added. She'd fought the one who'd attempted to kill Savannah, but there would be more. They were developing and protecting Skynet. Its future incarnation wouldn't leave a single machine in charge of such an important mission. That worried her. She could deal with humans without a problem. Terminators were different. John opened a bottle of water and took a long swig, processing what Cameron had said. It sounded like quitting talk to him, but he knew she wouldn't do that. We've got the LAW, launcher grenades, and the sniper rifle. And we've got Cameron. And they've got unmanned drones, Danny shot back. He realized he probably sounded like he was a coward, and maybe he was, but he wanted to survive this. Getting themselves killed did nobody any good. You're talking about flying us through a swarm of them to then take on an army. We won't make it through all that. I'll deal with that, Cameron smiled. She'd maintained a wireless link to the internet and had been searching for any news online, and she'd found something that had caught her attention. Get in the car, she told them all. She got up and headed outside, quickly followed by the others as they stepped after her into the harsh, hot air of the desert and crossed the forecourt. The air inside the car had heated to an unbearable degree, and John couldn't help but think of those ads about people leaving dogs in hot cars. He was still unused to the heat, and now he reckoned he knew how they felt. Cameron once again sat in the driving seat and turned the radio on, switching stations until she found the one she wanted. Listen, she instructed. Tensions with the Russian Federation have increased to levels not seen since the fall of the Soviet Union, as President Medvedev claims responsibility for the bombing of 4 radar installations in western Alaska. The Russian president announced the airstrikes against Air Force installations were in retaliation for the sinking of the cruiser Varyag 24 hours ago. Heated discussions between President Obama and the Russian premier have taken place, with neither side backing down. The president has stated any further aggression will be dealt with swiftly, and the Pentagon has upgraded to DEFCON 3. The last time the system was upgraded was just after 9/11. We'll have more on this story as it comes to us. Cameron turned off the radio. There was nothing new the broadcast would tell them. It's terrible and all, Savannah said, still eating the last of the fries she'd taken with her, not wanting to waste food. But how exactly is this relevant? It's Skynet, isn't it? John replied nervously. It's starting already. Probably, Cameron nodded. There's no record of military aircraft assigned to the area where the Varyag was attacked. She performed a rapid search and found no missiles had been expended. All combat aircraft on routine flights had returned with full payloads. But Skynet doesn't trigger J-Day until next year, Savannah said. July 8th, we've got 10 months yet. Danny tried to get his head around it, still finding it hard to believe Skynet could have come so far along. How could it be the AI he'd created? He'd have thought it'd be years away from practical application, not already trying to start a war by itself. So, Skynet sinks the Variag, knowing the Russians will retaliate and create tension, escalating it where it deems necessary, leading to the eventual Judgment Day. "In my future," Cameron said, recounting what future John had told her before. Skynet's nuclear strike was unexpected. The Russians launched a counterattack, but many of their missiles failed to launch. 30% of those that did never reached their targets. "Skynet's trying to start another Cold War," Ellison summarized. John nodded grimly, realizing the older man was right. If Russia's on alert when Skynet launches, then their missiles will be better maintained, and they'll fire everything they've got, John said. "It's about killing off more of us right at the start, taking out assets here that it missed the first time around, making sure we can't fight back afterwards." It was all about him again, he realized. Skynet had already taken his mom, Savannah, smashed their safe house and left them with very little to fight with. And now it was planning to do the same in the near future, taking out anything that could be remotely useful to any resistance movement. "We're not letting it get that far," he said, barely holding back the anger that threatened to boil his blood and explode outwards. "Pack the guns. We're moving out to Oxnard Airport in 5 minutes. This isn't just a rescue mission anymore. We're going to kill them all." He wasn't going to rest until every last gray and every single machine that wasn't Cameron was dead at his feet. "I've got something that can help," Cameron added. She understood Skynet's motivation behind the attack, and under other circumstances, it would have been a sound strategy. But there was one thing Skynet hadn't accounted for, and it was her. It knew she existed, but the other AI did not know what she was capable of, nor was it aware of her shared experiences with John Henry in the future. In creating tensions between the United States and Russia, to the point that the White House had upgraded to DEFCON 3, it had provided her the perfect opportunity to modify a previous plan and enact it without suspicion. She immediately opened up her connection to the defense net once more and gained almost instant access. She tapped her temple, where her chip was underneath her hyperalloy skull, and then looked to the others, then up into the air. Danny and Ellison stared at her, confused, but both John and Savannah looked at each other and then back at Cameron, the pair of them understanding completely what she was talking about. A loud knock on the door snapped Coleman's attention up from his computer screen, and he found himself glad that he had a distraction from the more mundane, tedious little bits of housekeeping and admin that seemed to come with the territory of secretly building an AI and a machine army to help it take over the world. "Come," he called out, looking towards the wooden door as it opened. Colonel Skiff, their Air Force liaison, entered the room in his normal blue office uniform, pressed immaculately as always, though Coleman could see the bags under his eyes and knew he'd probably been suffering from lack of sleep. Skynet had kept them all informed of the developments and the Russian airstrike, so he wasn't surprised that the man looked like he'd been run ragged. "Robert," he got up and extended his hand. "I wasn't expecting to see you here for another couple of weeks." Skiff shook his hand and took the seat on the other side of the desk, facing the gray. "Have you been paying attention to the news?" he asked, sounding as tired and harassed as he looked. "That I have," he replied. "I'm sorry to hear about it. How many people were killed?" "Only 4, thank God, and 38 wounded. 9 are critical." "How did it happen?" Coleman asked, feigning concern. He knew exactly how it had happened, and exactly how 4 Russian strike fighters were able to penetrate U.S. airspace and evade their F/A-22s so easily. Still, he had to keep up appearances. I'm only a businessman after all. NORAD located them on radar and Elmendorf, scrambled fighters, but some dipshit in a control tower misplaced a 0 and sent our birds on a wild goose chase while the Russians ran roughshod over us. Coleman had thought that was a particularly brilliant move by Skynet. Using the roving backdoor Charles Fisher had installed to gain access to NORAD, and altering the data sent from the radar dishes to the screens in the control room to send the intercepting fighters to the wrong place. From the data he'd seen, it had even created ghost signatures for the jets to follow, leaving the Russian planes free to bomb their targets at will. He rested his elbows on the desk and leaned forward. "Forgive me, Robert. It's tragic, but I don't see what it has to do with us." Skiff grinned wryly. "You don't? Well, I thought you'd be more on the ball than that. The fighter control officer who directed our birds has been taken off active duty and is under investigation for incompetence. An order's been issued that all fighter control staff are to receive enhanced training, but there's a growing number of top brass here who are starting to feel that no matter how much training, human error, however rare, is inevitable, and it's something we can ill afford. As of right now, we're on DEFCON 3, and exercise Blue Star has been canceled." Coleman stared at the officer in shock. They couldn't afford for the exercise to be canceled. They were on an extremely tough deadline here. He was glad for Skiff's sake that it was the pair of them discussing this, and that neither Baldy or steroids were present right now. He dreaded to think what the 2 Terminators would do to him. "Care to explain?" he asked, feeling himself go red. "Because the President and the Pentagon have upgraded to DEFCON 3. All exercises and all leave have been canceled. The good news for you is that because this attack could have been prevented, because it came down to human error, those in the Pentagon who are AI skeptics have either been converted or silenced, and the Skynet funding bill comes before Congress next week." He leaned forward slightly and laced his fingers together. "We're expecting it to pass. I've also been told to make you an offer," he said. "As you know, we've been developing a number of advanced, autonomous UCAVs for some time, but from what I've observed, nothing we're currently fielding comes close to your XQ-84 Dragonflies. The fact they were designed from the ground up to work with the AI, and their agility and loitering capability, was something that his superiors had been drooling over. And that wasn't even taking the impossibly reasonable price that Kaliba was asking for. The Pentagon has decided to shelve all current UCAV developments in favor of your aircraft. I've been authorized by my commanders to put an offer on the table, Mr. Coleman. $3.4 billion for an initial order of 186 Dragonflies." Coleman sat back for a moment and pretended to consider it. He'd known for a good long time that the Air Force would come around to adopting the XQ-84s. When they were selling them for $18 million each, less than half the price per unit of what the likes of Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and BAE asked to put their prototypes into production. Having the designs thought up by future Skynet and downloaded into Baldy's and Steroids chips, enabling them to skip all research and development, had helped keep the price tags low, all to entice the military into buying their drones over anyone else's, and ultimately their AI. "I thought that was going to be after the exercise," Coleman replied. He was actually very surprised at how fast this was all going. Skynet's tactic had been to sway the military into adopting it, but to accelerate it this much was beyond anything his and the others' wildest dreams. He could imagine the top brass squirming in their seats as they tried to explain how it had happened. He didn't know who they'd be more pissed at, the Russians for launching the attack or their own guys for failing to stop it. Heads were going to roll, and Skynet would be there to take their places. "I think we can call it a deal, Colonel," Coleman shook his hand once more. He got up and Skiff also got to his feet. I'll tell you what, he said. I'll show you a little more of what we're doing here. We've got a few more designs I think you'll be interested in. Creech Air Force Base, Nevada, despite the heat outside. Lieutenant Greg Archer swigged on his coffee and savored the rich caffeine as it worked through his system. He'd been paying attention to the news just as everyone else had, and he and the boys were half expecting war to be declared any moment. It was a tense time for everyone in the military. A few of the guys in his platoon had their leave canceled and were pretty pissed about it. Fucking DEFCON, he muttered to himself, quietly voicing the sentiments his guys all felt, but he, as a sergeant, couldn't air aloud in front of them. His leave had just been canceled. He'd booked a week in Rome with his wife in just under a month for their 10th anniversary. And if things didn't get settled soon, he could see what would happen to that. Forget the Russians, he thought to himself. If they want to see World War III, they should just tell my wife we won't be going on vacation. He sat at his desk and scrolled down the list on his computer of all the avionics and engineering checks that had been run on the aircraft they were responsible for. Now more than ever, with tensions rising with the Russians, they'd been told they needed all aircraft operational and ready to go. NORAD installations in Alaska had been bombed. The Russians were reportedly preparing to mobilize their Pacific Fleet as a show of strength, and the top brass wanted to show off their own by ensuring the West Coast was secure. That included all manned and unmanned aircraft at heightened alert. Another computer screen beeped as an incoming message came in. Greg turned from the first screen and looked at the second as his 2 Ike, Staff Sergeant Dan Spender, also peeked at it. Spender opened the message and saw a list of orders. He whistled as he read it, not quite believing what he was reading. Jesus, sir, he said. This can't be right, can it? They want 1/3 of our force armed for air-to-air combat and on Alert 5 status. Who the hell sent this? They'd never used their drones for aerial combat, outside of exercises. Yeah, they were capable of it, but generally they used jet fighters for that, not Reapers. Part of him wondered if this wasn't just a joke. That's what the order says, Archer shrugged. He looked at the order and who it was signed by. It's come from SecDef. That's his name signed right there. It's gotta be right. Still though, 18 Reapers and 4 X-45s, they're still experimental, not even meant to be used in combat yet. Well, consider this their baptism, Archer replied. We've got our orders. Get the guys on it. I want all these aircraft armed, fueled, and cleared for sortie in 4 hours. We're not at war yet, Dan, but you never know what's around the corner. No damn way was he going to get caught with his pants down like those poor bastards up in Alaska. Too much time spent in the cold wasn't good for a man, and he wasn't surprised someone made a mistake up there. Within minutes, his platoon had received their individual orders and had begun working on the designated UCAVs. Bombs and missiles were rolled out on wheeled racks and were fixed underneath wings and into bomb bays. Avionics technicians worked on the electrical components, whilst mechanics and engineers made sure the drones wouldn't fall out of the sky. Greg looked again at the list on screen and admitted privately that it was a hell of a lot. The Russians were preparing to mobilize their entire Pacific Fleet as a show of strength. This move must be part of ours, he reckoned. Still, there was such a thing as overkill, he thought as he looked at it in detail. 22 aircraft equipped with enough AMRAAMs and Sidewinders between them to take out the entire air force of a small country. The guys in charge were clearly expecting some serious shit to go down, and he figured if it came to blows, then at least with the UCAVs, none of their pilots would be at risk. He watched the work as the drones were inspected, calibrated, tested, fueled, and armed, a handful at a time, and found himself glad that nuclear weapons hadn't been included in the arsenal for the X-45 Sequotes. That's something at least, he thought. Still, as he watched his men at work and thought about what it was all in aid of, what it could come to if this thing didn't get resolved peacefully, he found himself getting nervous. I can kiss Paris goodbye, he thought glumly. His wife was going to kill him,